Innovation relies on iconoclasm. Innovation relies on smashing idols.
And true innovation requires nurturing. True innovation requires support. And true innovation requires space. Without any of those things, you won't have that at your company.
You know, if you had this idea of car, and then your MVP is somewhere between a bicycle and a motorcycle, and you'll iterate on that and end up in a car. Like, that is not gonna happen.
Hire smart people and let them figure out what to do.
You can have the best product strategy in the world. If you're not looking after your culture, then it doesn't matter.
Be positive. If you don't believe it's doable, then no one will.
This is your moment! Even a little bit of thought to the non-normal user can have a huge difference in their life.
Yeah, I'm fixing the world today. I encourage all of you to put your hands up and go for it.
All right, everyone, welcome to our Product Leaders Summit. Today, we're celebrating 5 years of amazing community and programming, but this year with an all-new virtual flair. So 5 years ago, a group of friends started this as a labor of love to bring the product leader community together to meet and share and inspire each other, because we know that this is where the real learning comes from, where when each of you meet, share challenges, share ideas, and make meaningful connections. So last night during our opening dinner with Mark Randolph, the co-founder of Netflix, he shared this slide with us. And I loved it so much, I pulled it into my welcoming remarks. Nolan Bushnell says, everyone who has ever taken a shower has had an idea, but it's the person who gets out of the shower, dries off, and does something about it that makes a difference. Well, 5 years ago, Gib Biddle and I grabbed a coffee at a Phil's coffee shop and talked about why isn't there a community for VP level product leaders? And then the light bulb went off and we're like, well, we're builders. Let's go ahead and build this community. So we recruited a couple of friends and we started Product Leaders Summit 5 years ago. So with that, I would love to have Gib just say hello.
Hi, everyone. I'm excited about my dual host timepiece today.
And then Sarah, why don't you come and say hello?
Hey, everybody. I got started with this over coffee as well. So recommend having coffee with friends.
And Dan, say hello.
Hey, Dan Olson. Yeah, I'm excited to be here with everybody and have an awesome day. Well,
awesome. So as we mentioned, this is a labor of love project to bring the product leader community together. And I'm really proud that this year we brought together 150 diverse product leaders out of a group of 1,000 amazing people who applied. And it is really well represented in the product community across business and consumer, different size stage companies. We have a concentration in the Bay Area, but then also around the US and internationally as well. And probably the most diverse group that you'll ever see at a conference in tech. So really proud of the community we brought together, and I'm excited that all of you are here this morning. So this year we were presented with a challenge of how do we do this virtually and still bring people together? And with the virtual format, we got a chance to experiment with lots of new things, including 3 icebreaker happy hours that we hosted right before the summit, where you got a chance to randomly get matched with another product leader in a one-on-one format. And we've had such great feedback on the icebreaker format that we'll probably do a few more after Product Leader Summit. And a few of us got a chance to meet each other solving riddles and puzzles last weekend through a virtual escape room where we learned about the history of Italy and the Medici family. And it was a lot of fun. Shout out to Stephanie Overholt, who is on my team, who was the superstar MVP, who really helped us escape the virtual escape room. And then, of course, last night, Mark Randolph kicked us off Mark shared wonderful stories about the founding story of Netflix. And really the lessons that we took away from it was, one, take risks. Two, not only come up with ideas, but lots and lots of them and experiment with them. And then three, stay eternally optimistic. So please, please take those lessons and carry them with you throughout your product journey. And today, we hope that you share some of your insights and learnings on social. So feel free to use these hashtags, Pound Product Leader Summit. And I'm one of the founding partners of Spiro Ventures. And normally we host this at Spiro Ventures physically every year. This year we couldn't do that, but hopefully you enjoyed the swag box that got sent out to you. And thank you again, Mark Randolph, for generously donating your books. All right, here's our program for this morning. So pretty soon I'll introduce our opening keynote speaker. And then after that, we'll have a little bit of a break before our first workshop starts. Most of us have already signed up for our workshops, but if you haven't, you can go to Luma/Product Leader Summit and see what workshops are available for you to attend this morning. And then after the first two workshops, we'll bring everybody back together to the main stage for our closing keynote. And then as we talked about, it's all about peer connections. And so we'll do some group breakouts this morning and we'll bring everybody back for a close. But hopefully the program doesn't just end there. And with that, I am thrilled to welcome our opening speaker, Des Traynor. Des is the Chief Strategy Officer and co-founder of Intercom, a product that we all use and love. And Des is going to be talking about scaling a product org without losing your soul. Just a really quick story. I got a chance to hear Des speak live 8 years ago in San Francisco when Intercom was not yet a well-known company. And after his talk, I was thinking, wow, this guy with the funny Irish accent really knows what he's talking about. So I've been trying to get Des to come speak at our Product Leader Summit for years now, but him being in Ireland has always posed a travel challenge. So it's been awesome to be able to do this virtually where Des said yes. So with that, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and welcome Des.
Thank you very much for the invite, and I'm glad we could finally make it work, and hello to everyone else. I will start sharing my screen now, and I apologize, this is my first proper Zoom conference delivery, so if stuff goes wrong, please do forgive and have patience. It's funny, I never thought I'd be more comfortable on a stage than I am standing up in my spare room, but there you go. This is the world we are in. So, I believe everyone can see my screen right now, or at least I'm going to take the bet that you can, and I'll start giving my talk, and I'm sure Hal will jump in if I'm wrong. I'm going to talk about scaling a product organization, specifically without losing your soul, because I think, I'm not sure what event Hal was referring to when she said she saw me speak, but Intercom has been quite a journey where we've kind of grudgingly conceded the idea that we might not be a tiny startup anymore over a series of maybe 9 years. The origin of the title comes from the idea that like young startups are inherently in some ways cool and old startups are inherently supposed to be boring, right? You're like, when you're young, everything you do is super polished, super slick. Everyone wants to hear about you. People want to write about you. And when you're old, you're basically a has-been. And you feel this need as you're in a growing startup to kind of rage against the dying light. And not become one of those like old companies that can't get anything right. So this is the idea that small startups can move fast and break things or obsess over details, whereas like the big startups move slowly and they just can't get anything right. And I think as Intercom has grown, we've had to kind of concede that maybe we're bigger than we were. And that alone has been a bit of a shock. But we've had to learn how to scale. So like in some sense it was like, stage one of Intercom might have been learning how to start. Stage two might have been learning how to scale. And where we are today, we spend a lot of time talking about excellence at scale, which is how can we actually be really good while being really big? or at least really big from our vantage point. I'm sure there are people out there who have product orgs that dwarf ours. So in terms of the origin of the title, like it's kind of refers to this idea that we have had to in many ways like lose our religion and concede ground. We've had to accept that, you know, there are people called marketers and people called sales who have opinions about what we build, and we need to learn how to work with them and not fight with them all the time. And we've just had to kind of concede that ground and grow up and accept that like some things like are a natural force of nature, but just as importantly, there are some things that are incredibly easy to slip into that are the habits of big companies that if you adopt them, you'll be handing away your competitive edge, which will be really important when you actually want to go and fight with them. So a brief history of Intercom very, very quickly. We started in 2011, a load of mad shit happened, and here we are in 2020. That's the kind of the summary of the company to date. And I'm sure more shit will happen in the future. But if we was to break it down a little bit, just from the point of view of letting you know what we've had to do along the way here, we went from 4 people to today, I think we're 670 or something like that. So obviously that has been a significant increase. We've added a lot of customers again from 0 to way over 30,000 or so. Our revenue crossed 150 million in our last public released figure, which I'm guessing is like January or so. And all of this, you know, kind of does not come for free. We also raised 245 million along the way, and we opened 5 different offices, 3 in the last few years. So all of these things each have a way of making things harder. So basically, I guess what I'm saying is it got more complicated. One way you could think about this is we started like this, and you know, you could reach out and touch the person who you were working with. Then we moved to this, which is when we felt like a real company, and today we're much more like this. We are orgs of orgs of orgs of teams of teams of teams. And what that looks like from a product perspective is we've gone from being just a product to being product and all of our friends who also care about what the hell product does. So my job today primarily is to make our R&D organization into an investable machine, something that can turn cash into code and code into cash. That is, we raise money off these beautiful people called venture capitalists, and that money is usually handed to me and to our marketing team and our sales team. And the rule is we should give them back something that's worth more than the money that was spent. So that in my line of work, that usually results in ideation, new product strategies executed, new lines of revenue, new channels of demand, all of which produce ultimately annual recurring revenue, which then increases the valuation of the business. And I would say that doing this is a lot like product management. Like I consider the R&D org, which is like all of design, engineering, and product management, all ultimately rolls up to me. I consider it like my job to be a lot like product management, but the two frustrations are like it's at a very, very abstract level with a very slow feedback cycle with billions on the line. To give you an idea of what I mean by the feedback cycle, I can receive headcount or I receive budget. So, hey, Des, we're going to add an extra $5 million of investment into R&D. Sounds great. That translates to a certain number of heads. I go and I execute the sort of hiring of those people. We onboard them, we put them to work. They ship a product. The product ships with some leading indicators, you know, like adoption rate, recurring engagement rate, that sort of stuff. And then at some stage down the line, it hits an actual outcome metric that the company cares about. And an outcome metric might be something like net dollar retention. So has it made people less churny? Or it might be like ACV expansion. Are people buying it more, spending more money? The start to end on this can be honestly years long, which is just, it's a lot harder these days than it was when you used to like put the feature live, see if anyone uses it. If they don't, kill the feature. If they do, ship it like for everyone, you know, which was the sort of primitive way we would operate back then. So in prepping for this talk, I was trying to think about what has gotten really hard and what do I think we've gotten correct. So I'll anchor this around this idea of here are some ingredients of a sometimes great product organization, in my opinion. This is by no means an exhaustive list because I don't have them all. We are not always great. We, like all of you, ship mistakes. We make mistakes. But I do think that we have occasionally had moments of greatness, and that's shown up as well in our growth and our customer base and our general satisfaction. So I'd like to walk you through each of these, and then we can have some Q&A at the end. So the first of them that I think we have invested heavily in is strong principles and strong process. And I'll break these out into 2 different sections. Firstly, principles. One of my favorite quotes by Clay Christensen is actually nothing about disruptive theory or jobs to be done or any of that. It's from his book, How Will You Measure Your Life, where his closing line is, decide what you stand for and then stand for it all the time. And for us, what that means is there is a certain way that we fundamentally believe we'll build software well. And we need to do it like that, ideally all the time, but certainly more often than not. We establish these principles that kind of codify what we believe to be best practice, best behavior, the stuff that we've seen the highest success rate from. But to do that, we have to talk a lot internally about what principles are. And for us, good product principles will inform significant decisions. Should we go harder or on the lead generation software, or should we exit the market entirely? What do our principles say? Good principles are executed frequently. They're not something that only applies once a year at roadmap time. They're something you can constantly come back to. They're opinionated and they're not truisms, and I'll talk about that in a second. They can be used to evaluate a decision. Was it literally in line with our principles, or was it something that, that was totally like countercultural? And they change rarely. You can't adopt these things and then just flip-flop on them every other quarter, depending on who you hire or the state of the project or whatever. So we've put a lot of time into thinking about principles. A point I made at the early days in Intercom was that the opposite of a good principle should be a good principle too. Because otherwise you end up with principles that are like nonsense, like we build great software. Well, there's not a lot of companies out there proudly saying we build shit software. So the opposite of that principle isn't a good principle, right? But here's orthogonal principles that I think are both valid. We prioritize power users and design for speed of their interactions. So that might be, say, superhuman, right? New users should be productive under first use. They're like, you can't do both of those easily. Now, you can hack it in edge case and special case, but we prioritize product consistency versus we optimize every screen to be as perfect as it can. They're orthogonal principles. You pick one of those two. And I think that's a really, really important thing. The opposite of a principle that you adopt in your company should also be a good principle. Otherwise, you're just saying things that sound nice. And most of the posters on most of the walls will always just say things that sound nice. But for me, it's a perfect example of this is move fast and break things, move slow and never make a mistake are both valid. One for a bank, one for a social network. It makes perfect sense. So here's our principles. At the highest level for Intercom, we have 3 principles that describe how we build. We always start with the problem, and I'm not going to read out all the explanations. We always think big, then start small and learn fast, and we deliver outcomes. That's the things we obsess about most in Intercom. And then within our design org, we have a set of principles that tell us how we should make our design decisions. We believe in connected modular systems, opinionated by default, follow fundamentals. It should always feel personal, and ultimately what you ship is what matters. So don't give us designs that won't go live. We actually only care about the thing that goes live. And lastly, our engineering principles are similar as well. We cover our offices back when, remember, offices used to be a thing? Well, we used to cover the walls of our offices with these principles because it literally describes everything about what we do and how we work at Intercom. And the more we can circulate this knowledge and standardize on it, the faster the product teams move, the less circular debates they have, the less kind of long withstanding turf wars that get had. Whenever we find ourselves repeatedly faced with a decision type where it's like A or B, and our decision logic is similar, it either there's a principle we're missing, or there's an application that the PM was failing to see. So that's the first thing I'd say is we really firmly believe in principles. The other side of principles for us is when we're faced with decisions and questions about product areas, we used to always ask internally, what's the real question? Was the thing we used to say. However, I was reading a doc by Shishir over at Coda, Coda being the sort of new documentation product. And he introduced me to a term called an eigen question. The eigen question is when you're faced with a long list of things that we don't know, the eigen question is the single question that if we can answer that, answers everything else as well. So to give an example of eigen questions and how they play out in Intercom, it's like somewhat well understood that Intercom competes with a Danish company called Zendesk. We often, when we're in the support space, ask ourselves questions like this. And ultimately, the actual eigen question we realize is this one. And if we can answer this one, everything else flows out of it. And ultimately, you're wasting your time trying to answer any other question here until you've actually answered the eigen question. So that's a common term we'll use. And if an eigen question doesn't have an answer, or if it keeps coming up in different forms, that's usually a sign that you should work out a way to either connect it to an existing principle, or if necessary, and I'm reluctant to do this, add another principle. We don't want a massive amount of principles ultimately, because then they just become, well, it just becomes kind of less useful. The other side of principles is process. And in general, Intercom works like this. We have a mission: make internet business personal. We have a set of strategies that fall from that. One might be in the customer support space. We say we're going to build next-gen support. An objective within there might be, well, we need to be omnichannel. An intermission, which is our basically how we define a project, might be deliver WhatsApp integration. And then the release might be WhatsApp, beta V2 or whatever. But we kind of follow this thread all the way down, where everything should basically serve the master goal. And there's a kind of a transliteration you can apply at each step to change it from, say, a business, from a mission statement to a business impact statement, down to a product statement, and down to a product release. Our process for getting software live is pretty robust at this stage. It's kind of quite battle tested. We have 5 stages that we work through. And I won't articulate all of them, but I'll just kind of cover a couple. We don't let people start work until we understand a problem. It is a waste of time, and we've thrown away more code, more design, more Google Docs than you'd ever imagine, simply by not fully grasping what the problem is first. And examples of this are problems that are not stated in terms of customer value. So you can't start working against a problem such as, we would like to increase the amount of seats that our customers buy. That's not a problem. A problem is cross-team engagement, or people can't share tickets with their colleagues. That's a problem. And an output of that problem might be, as a result, people might start buying more seats or whatever. So we have to have a really clear definition of a problem that an actual real customer experiences. When faced with a problem, the first stage we have is we think big. So that's like, what's the best solution we could ship here? That's so we have a sense that the natural trajectory of the work we're about to start ends in a great place, and it's not a dead end. Next, we start small, because we have a firm belief that we have to take small steps and measure our success and make sure we're going in the right direction. Step 4 follows right out of that. It's learn fast. So that's, we run betas, we get feedback, we look at metrics, we look at usage, adoption, engagement, recurring, and one time. And lastly, ultimately, the only reason product teams exist, the only reason an R&D org exists, is to deliver outcomes. Now, for our process, we have effectively codified the whole thing in Coda. This is our Coda dashboard here, where you can sort of see on the left nav, you've got all of the different stages that we can walk through. We have like how to start, how to think big, how to run a beta, etc. And this is like, to us, this is one of the reasons we've gotten to a point where we have like 25 product teams and we have predictable, reliable output. Because the alternative, where we were, say, 5 years ago, was everything had to wash through either Paul Adams, who's our SVP of product, or my hands, or at the time our CEO, Owen's hands. Somebody was always involved in like reviewing or seeing what was happening. And depending on what time of day it was, what mood you caught certain people in, there was such insane variance, and not in a good way, in terms of what we were actually doing. Some things would go straight live to production, having never seen a customer. Other things would be stuck in a beta for months, and there was just nothing that standardized it. So we invest a lot in making sure that our principles are solid, so that when decisions need to be made, they can ideally be made very fast. And then our process is solid, so that for any given project, you can work out where it is, what's going to happen next, how does it go wrong. A word on process, though, and I think this is where a lot of companies can often go wrong, is typically I see startups ship their first big mistake, their first bad release, their first bad design. And the knock-on effect of doing so is someone freaks out internally, and then they say, let's never make that happen again. The right number of mistakes in a company is not 0. And that's something people need to fundamentally understand. In fact, getting something to zero comes at an insanely high cost, near infinite cost. You have to expect and accept some deviance, some like error tolerance, and that means bad shit will ship occasionally. The way I think about process is this, right? Most projects can either be an absolute fail, an absolute success, but most of them are somewhere in between. A bad process simply narrows the error bars. It doesn't, like, for every single downside you restrict upside too. A terrible process only restricts, it improves the downside, but at a significant cost of upside, right? And a good process is one that can limit the downside with no cost to the upside. So people are free to be just as creative, but we've put in the right safety guards, the right guardrails to keep things on track. And I would encourage you all, before you say some version of Des said process is good, or we should build more process into our org, is just investigate the ROI of your process and make sure you're not costing yourself the chance to be brilliant to ensure that you don't ever ship a few mistakes. There needs to be a bit of give, but I would urge you all to evaluate your process and make sure that it is actually a net improvement on things, as opposed to just a shrinkage of the error bars on both sides. So that's principles and process. A second piece I'd say is manage your org like a system. And generally speaking, product and engineering teams do projects that change the product, that changes the behavior of the customers. But I'll build this up for a second. Product and engineering teams basically ship projects that take inputs and they effectively produce outputs in the form of software that changes what customers do, which is ultimately your outcome. And your outcome is usually measured in terms of some core metric that actually matters. Generally speaking, we're familiar with talking about these things in terms of roadmaps, shipping, and then customer change. And the actual outcome is a customer problem might get solved, a piece of product might get changed, and you might see a new business result as a result of it. And the point I'd always try to make to people is just ensure in your org that your actual outcomes are inputs to your roadmap. I think a lot of people will ship things that do nothing, and they'll measure the fact that it did nothing, and then they'll carry on like as if all was good. And I would firmly argue against that, because it's both, you're not learning from wasted effort, but also you're just mindlessly deploying code that now needs to be maintained, and it's not actually doing anything useful for you. So I would just, I think of Intercom's R&D org as inputs, outputs, and outcomes, and I care about each of them equally. But I ask these sort of questions, when you're asking what's going on in inputs, the questions are like, what drives the roadmap? Like, how do you learn from what you ship, etc. Outputs is a question of like, can you ship fast? Is your product org investable? If I gave you $5 million more, would you be able to do anything useful with it for me? Can you produce a reliable amount of output? Are you predictable? Outcomes is, does the work actually work? Like, when you do all this, does the business get more valuable? Can you predict change in behavior? Are your changes in behavior correlating with changes in like business impact? They're the sort of questions that I think. So I encourage, you won't be able to follow every single piece of your org, every project, every piece of work. So it's essential that you have some abstraction that works for how you can actually conceptualize what's happening in your company. Mine is inputs, outputs, outcomes. That's all I think about. If something's going wrong, there's a bug in one of these three. A third piece, as you grow, probably the most painful thing we saw as we grow, as we bring in all of this sort of industry, I want to say veterans, but folks who come in from loads of different startups with loads of different frameworks, rubrics, methodologies, language, lingo, etc. You have to stamp it out, unfortunately, and it feels pretty dogmatic, but you kind of need the same metrics, the same messages, the same words everywhere. Everyone should only care about a certain set of metrics. That sort of set of metrics should cascade, as in everything should feed up, but there should be no metrics that people don't care about. Otherwise, you'll have someone come in and say, oh, well, at Facebook, we use a thing called L57, and all of a sudden you have an L57 dashboard. Doesn't mean anything, and people are chasing it. And it's just like, you have to be really careful. Only care about what matters, because the only things that matter will be the things that drive your business. So for us, we talk about this as like Intercom level, which affects the valuation of the company, account level, which affects the value of our customers, and product level, which affects the value of our actual product. Any metric anyone wants to talk to me about has to fit into one of these categories, and they all have to cascade up. And it's so important for this, because I always say, like, if you want your team to make the same decisions you would make, They need the same data and the same perspective that you would have. And you have to understand, like, you have dashboards for all these things. That's what they need. They need to know the value that you're expecting them to drive. Another piece I'd say, just from a new hire onboarding point of view, if nothing else, no transliteration. So whenever there are two names for anything, and we have this problem in Intercom all the time, and I go insanely firm about this, but it'll be so easy as the product grows and gets old that you'll have multiple different ways to refer to the same thing, and that makes it a nightmare for a new person to start in. Imagine if you started in McDonald's tomorrow and there's 7 words for French fries. It's like you're not going to be very productive on day one, right? And now imagine it's something with the complexity of a 600-person, 7-year-old product company, and there's 5 different words for one product. It is like, efficiency is leverage in startups. It's some of the best leverage you have. Old companies that are huge don't have it, and you have it as at least as an option. So anything that hurts efficiency is going to kill you. Another piece I'd say is we invest heavily in this concept of the same language from code to customer. So whenever we decide on something, it has to be called that everywhere. So to give you an example, on Tuesday, we released a feature called Series. In the top left, you'll see the code is called Series, and in the middle, you'll see in the UI, it's called Series, and on our marketing side and in our marketing URL, it's called Series. Same language from code to customer is essential because it means no one will ever get confused about what's connected to what. I just assumed this module was called Series. It took me 4 seconds to find an Intercom. I don't even write code. But like you need that sort of clarity of and singularity. It helps so much. As you grow, you have to evolve how you roadmap. And I care most about inputs to our roadmap. And I was interested to see this letter from 99 from Amazon, where Bezos said specifically, senior leaders are often surprised how little Amazon cares about financial outputs, but they believe that focusing the energy entirely on controllable inputs to the business is the most effective way to maximize the outputs over time. I 100% agree with that. Our 7 inputs to our roadmap are here: current customers, iterations, new ideas, churn, product health, voice of sales, competitive landscape. But we spend most of our time perfecting these inputs or getting them to the best form possible. We, generally speaking, read a shitload of feedback, and we're always parsing and digesting and getting this feedback into the most actionable forms possible. I'll show you one example, which is our customer voice report. So our customer voice report it's probably like 2 people maintain this, perhaps nearly full time. We can see for any given request in Intercom, every single conversation that ever referenced it. We can chase it back to the original discussion. We can analyze it by, is it a product confusion? Is it a feature request? Is it a how do I, or is it a bug? And we can rank it by the revenue impacted by the request. So that gives us a really, really rich way to analyze exactly the things we should build. Another example will be our input from sales. So again, if this is input from people who are using Intercom today, this is input from people who can't use Intercom. And it's a classic thing you'll find in B2B. People don't have a good way to listen to voice of sales because they're not in your product asking for features because they never got there because you lacked some compliance or some feature. So every deal that's lost in Intercom due to product reasons is categorized and is broken out and is allocated to the right PM or designer or wherever the issue belongs. And for them, they can then categorize it, again, grouping it by revenue, and again, making sure that we're working on the highest impact things that will deliver ultimately the highest value for the business. A third example of this would be our defect dash. So every single bug in Intercom is tracked by how often it happens, who it happens to, and the actual value of the customers it happens to. So if all of our customers are affected by a bug, it spikes to the top immediately. If 1 or 2 of our largest customers are affected, it'll spike probably to the top 20, top 30, fairly high. But again, this is like, you might be watching this saying like, that seems like a ridiculous investment. I would just say that having phenomenal inputs to the system and having a workable system is much better than having, the God himself or herself's product team with the wrong inputs listening to the wrong customers. You need insanely good inputs to actually build a good product. A couple more quick points I'd say that have helped. At Intercom, we say product quality is a first-class citizen. The reason I believe in this firmly is because good people want hard challenges. It's actually easy to attract great people to work on hard things. It's hard to get great people to work on average things or mediocre things. And building high-quality software is remarkably hard. So it kind of follows to me that if you have to do something hard, let's at least make sure that it's really high quality software, because at least the business benefits from that too. So to put it real simple terms, I don't know whose product this is, but this is a beautiful looking help desk. I would argue you would get better designers, engineers, PMs excited to work on maintaining this product. Again, I don't know who it is, than you would on, say, this product, which is, I think, ServiceNow, for example. It's just like people are more excited to work on stuff that feels great and feels like the future. So you always, in my opinion, should nudge people to look for the best version of what they're doing. These are the sort of questions I consistently ask during product reviews. If this had to be impressive, what would you do? What are you least proud of it? Where did we trade off? If I gave you more time, what would you do? And the reason we do this is because we want people to be really proud of their work, but also we want our customers to experience the brilliance of the work. And I mentioned series earlier as the thing we shipped. This is like literally like 7 hours of feedback on series, but it comes in, I say this not to boast, but just to say, like, forget about the value of this to Intercom. Think about the people who worked on series and think of how good this makes them feel, and think about how exciting they are to come to work tomorrow. That's the reason why we care about quality software. It's because it actually matters. The counterbalance to like this, obviously, because the danger of saying, all right, we care about quality software, is you spend your whole time navel gazing, right, and just like never shipping anything because it has to be like the most amazing thing ever. We have this concept that we call like sliders at Intercom, which is sometimes we say, you know what, this doesn't need to be innovative. It's just a Salesforce integration. Get it out the door. And so in that world, we sort of say, hey, sometimes we're going to anchor on just delivery, right? This is not an area where we're going to build our brand. This is just going to be a delivery piece. And people are willing to accept that sort of production mindset when they know that when it really matters, they're going to get to do the best work of their career. And as long as you can make that promise, you'll actually get surprisingly productive work on this sort of, on these sort of, how would you say, like less urgent, less brand building product opportunities. And the last ingredient for me is just people and how you invest in people. I think genuinely all great R&D orgs are just entirely about the people. If you don't have a good way of retaining great people, you'll experience organizational amnesia. This is when an organization cannot remember anything about what it was doing or how it was like progressing, because it's just constantly churning PMs. There is no single person you can lose that's costs you more at any given point than a PM, because engineers write code, and good engineers usually self-document because code is self-documenting. A good PM, when they go, if you don't have like a great written culture or whatever, it's so painful. So I would say for you who have a larger PM team or a growing PM team, invest in a clear framework for how you evaluate them. We evaluate PMs across 5 categories, and here they are here: business strategy, product strategy, execution, management, and leadership. And for each of these, we actually have courses that you can take in Intercom to get much better at them. We have, there's literal development opportunities for every single one of these so that people can get really good at these areas. For example, here's our product training we did in San Francisco a couple of years ago, and it's like 200 slides. It's like me and Paul will do it or whatever, but it's all about getting people up to this really, really high caliber sort of mindset effectively. And I'd also encourage you to embrace the diversity of skills amongst your leadership team. They won't all be the same. You'll have all-rounders. You'll have people who are insanely good at business, people whose product judgment is excellent. And you know, ideally, you want a set of these, because some challenges are very businessy and some challenges are very producty. And ideally, a diversity and leadership type is really valuable here. And the last piece I'll say before I conclude is just investing in consistently keeping people aligned in your org. We started as 4 people, and alignment became very obvious, because as you grow, you'll make one hire and maybe one person disagrees, and maybe they disagree on how we build or how we make decisions. And if you don't realign them or just sort of say, hey, we should have clarified this earlier, this is the way we like to do this, they'll go and hire, and before you know it, you have a whole org going off, or a whole sub-org that's gone off in the wrong direction. And it's really hard to wind that back, and it's incredibly expensive, and it brings back our old friend organizational amnesia. Put simply, like, misaligned people will misalign people, and it's not their fault, it's yours. So hire them, keep them, grow them, and keep them aligned. That brings us to the end of this piece. Those were some ingredients of a sometimes great product organization, I think. I hope you found it useful. I'm Des Traynor. You can follow me on Twitter or mail me. I'm just Des. Thank you very much for your time. I'm happy to take any questions.
Wow,
Yay.
that's amazing.
Yay.
Talk. We have a ton of activity in the chat. I think we're only going to have time for a couple of questions though. So for the first question, Bruno gets to ask it. So Bruno, do you want to go turn on video and go off mute and ask your question.
Hey, yes, thank you, Des. It was awesome. Strong believer on strong principles and process as well. My question is, when defining principles, how, and at least historically for you, how collaborative have you made it, or leader-led or founder-led? Because in my experience, if it's too collaborative, it's diluted, it becomes a platitude, and like it's not useful anymore. And it's, but you got to bring people in. So how have you approached it?
I think the final sign-off has always been with like Paul for product or Dara for engineering, and that's mostly because you have to tie break. There are literally people in Intercom who would have argued we should not learn fast. We should be more waterfall-like or whatever. Like because principles are necessarily divisive, you're going to like upset some people, and as a result, I don't believe you can kind of come to a conclusion as a sort of holocratic mindset. So I think ultimately the sign-off needs to be with the function lead who's going to stand over it. Dara is ultimately responsible. He's our head of engineering for all how we engineer. And if our whole team walks out the door, he has to hire a whole new one. So like it's kind of all on him. In terms of actually like the inputs that you take from the org, I think the best thing you can do is like take as inputs examples of decisions that were either hard to make or made inconsistently across the org. So, hey, I noticed you let those people ship with bugs, but over here you said everything had to be perfect, whatever. So you're trying to look for these frequently occurring kinks in logic across the company, and that's usually a sign that there's a missing principle, or like the definition of a principle could be expanded to be more encompassing. So I think you want the context of like where they're needed to surface up, but you probably need like the at the top line, you probably want like your function lead to actually make the deciding calls, if you like, the things that are going to piss people off, to be frank, because like you're always going to have to upset somebody when you're standardizing behaviors.
Thanks, Des. Okay, so the next question, we're going to have Paralee go on camera to ask a question live. Paralee.
Sounds good. Thanks so much, Des. That was an awesome talk. I was curious, the point you made about getting your organization comfortable with a failure tolerance that's not zero really resonated with me. And I was curious about how you talk cross-functionally about failures to avoid overcorrections, right? Everybody looks to a failure and says, okay, how do we never fail again? Versus how do we, maybe not make that failure again, learn from it, evolve, but keep a healthy failure tolerance. I think there's kind of conversations within product and engineering, certainly, but I'm curious how you talk about it outside of that org, where often I find the failure tolerance can be a lot lower.
Yeah. So like I sit on the board of Intercom, and I occasionally have to get up and say, hey, remember that thing I told you was going to be dope? No one used it. And I guess like the thing I will always try to do our best to like pull our product, our board back to is this idea of like, we need to explore the solution space. And like venture capitalists like some of my best friends are venture capitalists, et cetera, right? But what I would say is like they're weird for an industry that's steeped so heavily in risk. They're weirdly non-false tolerant when they actually get to managing a company itself. I think that the point you have to make is that error bars point, which is I can make sure this never happens again if you're willing to accept the idea that loads of things that look like this that would have worked will also never happen again. And I think there are probably industries where you can't afford the risk, and there's maybe points of scale where you can't afford the risk either. So like we are probably atypical to like a lot of companies in that we have like tens of thousands of customers. So so no one customer is like responsible for more than say like 0.5% of our revenue or something like that. But like the danger is we can easily get 30,000 bug reports with one erroneous deploy. I think you need to sort of when something went wrong for what I would either call a predictable reason, like as in the knowledge was there at the start. How do we have pre-mortem to this at the start? We knew everything we needed to know to spot that this was going to go wrong. Examples would be, this was a wide-ranging technical challenge and we put a junior leader on top of it and with no principal engineer overseeing it, et cetera, et cetera. Like when you're kind of cooking a failure and you're looking at the ingredients and you're like, yep, this is going to go wrong. That's not a good setup, right? So I'd always encourage people to sort of do that sort of pre-mortem. But in general, I would say like, software is like, I would argue Intercom's roadmap is a combination of table stakes, which is stuff where we know exactly what we're doing. We have to add syncing to our Salesforce integration. We're not trying to explore the solution space there. We know exactly what it is. Just build the syncing and get on with it. And then there's like, things like say series on Tuesday, which could have been a flop. It could have been a flop. People could have said, oh, day late, dollar short, blah, 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 but it wasn't. But when you're exploring the solution space, if you don't have the freedom to make mistakes, you don't have the freedom to make anything. And like, so like to our board, I'll always just make the point of like, look, you're going to evaluate us on our losses. I'm going to evaluate us on our hits. And P.S. I'm the one in here who's got the like $150 million revenue business, not you. Like, you have to kind of make that trade-off. So like, if we're not willing, if you're going to decrease the exploration of the solution space, don't be surprised if you see less products go live and less success happening. So like that as long as you can explain it like a pendulum. I think the only other point I'd say is if we were already, I can see how like if you'd like billions in revenue and half your job is just maintaining it, I could see how the tolerance risk shrinks in because you're much more like observing about like, we need to have a hit and a beat this quarter and we've projected blah. Fine, but like I would I'd say defend to your life the ability for people to try things that might work, as long as they're not doing dumb shit or doing it in really ineffective ways.